Well, Mary Forsythe, I cannot believe that I'm getting this opportunity to speak with you. I am blown away by your book, by your story. I couldn't put the book down. It was what they say, a page turner. Just I couldn't believe that this was a real story, that this was your true story. And I'm sure when you're in the midst of it, thinking, how is this happening to my life? And so I'm just in awe of it all. So, Mary, welcome to the More Than Your Age podcast.
Gosh, it's really just a pleasure to be here and to meet you and see you face to face. And so thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. I just appreciate Megan is our mutual connection, and she had reached out and said that she thought that I should reach out to you and interview you. And as soon as she told me just a little bit, and then we spoke on the phone, I said, "Yep, this woman needs to be a guest." And then I ended up getting your book, and I needed to read that as well. So your book, your story is so full, it's so rich, and like I mentioned, just quite honestly unbelievable. There were multiple moments while reading where my jaw just dropped open in shock of what you experienced and how your life just drastically changed. And a lot to discuss, as we mentioned before we started recording, just in this 1 hour conversation. So we'll just see what we can do. We'll do our best. But you had a very successful pharmacist. Became a very successful pharmacist in Dallas. You earned great wealth. You lived in Highland Park. And for those listeners who don't know Highland Park is a very affluent neighborhood in Dallas, if not the most affluent in the Dallas area. In your book, you stated you paid cash for a black Mercedes. You wore designer clothes. You had it all. But you had pain from your past. You wrote, I realized that moving to Dallas had not changed anything inside of me at all. Nothing I had done or acquired had been able to release me from the torment of my past. Why was that the case?
Erica, I didn't know how to process all the pain and all the things that were going on inside of me, even as from a child. I wasn't abused as a child, or I had what would call a normal childhood. I was raised in Western Kentucky, mom, dad, sister. Nothing real remarkable. The interesting thing is I don't have a single childhood memory of feeling accepted. And I don't know why I processed life that way. It's not anything that I can put my finger on, but I just never felt included. And it didn't matter if I was invited to a birthday party or not invited to a birthday party. It's kind of what I call my lenses for life, where no matter what you did or didn't do towards me, I perceived it as rejection. And so by the time I went to college, I just had tons of pain. I felt like an orphan. And then in my second year of college, I was raped. And because I did not know how to process pain, it was like I pushed the button on a trash compactor and just pushed all that pain down. And my life just got darker and much more, a lot more pain and trauma. And I just did not know how to process life.
Hmm. Did you, because not knowing how to process life or the things that you experienced, not feeling included, because there was a situation too with you're trying to join a sorority and didn't get accepted there. And so that kind of just like furthered this feeling of lack of acceptance. You chase this wealth. Was the wealth a way to feel accepted by other people because, you had all the things and all the money and all the glitz and glam?
Yeah, I think it was a mixed bag of tricks, kind of to say, because I started my first business when I was 6, which was a lemonade stand, and I had 100% marketing because I would run out in front of the cars. I took a card table, put it out right next to the street, maybe a little bit in the street, and very aggressive marketing plan. And I would just literally stand out and put my hand out in front of all the cars, and so I had 100% sales. So by the time I was 13, I'd saved $100, and to this day, we don't know how I even knew there was a stock market. And I took that $100 to my grandmother and I said, "Grandmother, can you put this in the stock market for me?" So I don't know, I've always been wired that way. But yes, the pursuit of all these different ways to live, I did not know it. It was subconscious, but I was looking for pain relief, affirmation, worth, significance, and value. And I tried education. I got a degree in pharmacy. I tried education. I tried wealth. I tried possessions, relationships, everything. And I just kept pushing because I wasn't satisfied. And I didn't realize that, when you read part of something I wrote in my book, A Glimpse of Grace, I didn't realize that the stuff on the inside obviously goes with you everywhere you go.
Yeah.
And so until I learned to kind of sort that, I was gonna I was the source of the problem.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, to talk about your pharmacy, or as well, just your career, to your pharmacy became the hub for many individuals diagnosed with HIV, AIDS. How did that come to be?
Yeah, I was, I owned the store. I also had about 6 other businesses. I was, a consultant. I did animal care, believe it or not. I pretty much I also excelled in supplements. People came from all over just to get advice about their own health. It's pretty common now, but back then there was just not a lot of pharmacists that took their time. And I had a couple of, and this was at the very beginning of the HIV quote unquote scare. And most of my peers in the pharmacy world, like at different chain drugstores, they would not even carry the medicine that was for HIV because they didn't want the HIV patients coming in their store. So I was willing to do that. And so probably the top 5 to 6 infectious disease doctors in the Dallas Metroplex knew of my store because I was willing to welcome the patients. In fact, I even had a delivery service, and those doctors knew that if they called their prescriptions into me, I would have my driver and my little red truck take the medicines directly to the patients who were obviously pretty sick. And this was a disease to me from the very beginning that, I saw it affect all sectors of society. In fact, Eric, I'll never forget when the first woman came into the pharmacy. Um, the doctors, sometimes it was so embarrassing back then, and people were so ostracized because of that disease. Sometimes the doctors would call and say, hey, Mary, I've got a VIP patient. Could you see her at the end of the day? Which meant my pharmacy closed at 7. He would send that patient in at 7 so nobody else would be in the store, and I would take care of that person. And so, again, I'll never forget the first time the doctor called and said, "I've got a VIP patient," and at the end of the day, a woman showed up. She was an attorney from Tyler, Texas, and she had gotten HIV from a blood transfusion, and her family had ostracized her. Her husband had taken the children, divorced her,
Oh, wow.
the whole town had turned on her, and probably spent 2.5 hours listening to her story after I filled her prescription. So it was very emotional, very encompassing of every sector of society for me. So, and then people started coming from all over the country because I didn't know this until later, but I was given the name the AIDS lady. So
Wow.
I didn't even know that until many years later.
So, excuse my ignorance in this, with because there were other pharmacies that would not accept patients with HIV or AIDS to distribute the medication. How were you able to get the medication, or did you just get ingredients and then you, as a chemist, you combined the ingredients? How does that work?
Well, the other pharmacies just refuse to order it. Like, if you go to a pharmacy and say, "Oh, we don't have that medicine," you go to somebody that has it, right?
Yeah.
So they just didn't order it. And then so I was ordering it, and then, during this time, I also launched my own insurance business. So I was one of the first pharmacies in the Metroplex to personally file insurance. So then people were really flocking to the store. And after, I think, about a year, one of the doctors, one of the infectious disease docs, called me and said there was a government program that if I signed on, the government would send me the HIV medicine called Retrovir, or AZT. Some people might remember that from the late 80s, early 90s. And those patients would have signed on to the government to get free AZT because it was super expensive. It had just been released from experimental status, so it was highly coveted. It was being marketed as the miracle drug, and other pharmacies weren't carrying it. So not only was I billing people's insurance, I was now signed up as a government wholesaler, so to speak, and was distributing HIV medicine, the antiviral, for the government.
Okay, so you had the government contract, and so sometimes the doctors prescribe the medicine to be billed to an insurance company and then one billed to a state program. if you had both prescriptions, you would fill them, but you said it was technically permissible but ethically questionable. And I kind of want to know a little more about that. And then also this gentleman named Thomas who came in, he was one of those questionable patients. What happened with him? And then how did this ethically questionable prescriptions, how did that increase?
Well, it really got crazy. I mean, it just got out of hand quickly. I I did not again, a doctor many times they would write for 2 prescriptions where the patient could get it from the government. I never signed any of the patients up. And let me say this, Erica, I want to take full responsibility for everything that happened and that I know we'll get to this, but that ended up with me being incarcerated for 5 years. So I want to take full responsibility. I mismanaged government inventory, government property. A lot of the things that the government accused me of, I did. Some of the things they accused me of, I didn't do, and I probably did some things I got away with. So I just want to be clear that I want to take full responsibility. But so it was inundating. I had hired a pharmacist and a technician to kind of handle that program because the pharmacy was doing so well. I was at the time engaged to be married and working on other entrepreneurial projects as I do. I was busy looking, I was working on a patent for Lancome to develop a makeup sponge. I was looking at a China factory in Hungary to purchase. So I was a pretty busy gal. And so when I hired these two other people, their real names I changed their names in the book, but their real first names are Mary and Martha. So it was Mary, and Martha that ended up getting indicted on 15 felony counts. So and when I turned over the state program to them, we had no idea it was going to be a multi-million dollar program. And we were literally running that program from a yellow pad, just a yellow sheet, like one of those college things. And then Martha eventually shifted it over to 3x5 cards. So when we ended up going to trial, they're like, "Where are your records?" And we handed them a box with 3x5 cards. They couldn't believe it. And, that was our naivete, actually.
Are you able to share what happened with Thomas?
Well, I probably changed his name in the book, so I'm not for sure which patient you're referring
Oh,
to.
okay.
I changed everyone's name that, I didn't have permission, so I'm not for sure which patient you're talking about.
Okay, so I'll
Give
refresh
me a
your
little
memory.
background. Yeah.
Yes, so he was somebody known in DC, and
Oh, okay.
he and
I got you. I got you.
okay.
So, yeah. So let me just say this: by the time I went to trial, all my patients had died. And so, I didn't have any witnesses that were patients. So unfortunately, they have all passed away. And so Thomas, I know exactly who you're talking about. Yeah, I was working super hard 7 days a week, even though I was closed on Sunday. I would go into the pharmacy, restock, do some things, get paperwork done. And one Sunday, I did that, and I came home, flipped on the television. I think it was 60 Minutes that I popped on, and I looked on the screen. I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's Thomas. Wait a minute, Thomas was Thomas?" He was actually a known person in DC, and he had come to me. And many of the patients, which I did not know until that moment, the doctors would write prescriptions in an alias name, again, just because of the shame and people wanting to hide and not be, open with their medical situation. So the next time I saw Thomas, I did just acknowledge that I'd seen him and that I committed to him that I would never tell anybody who he was, and that's true to this day.
Wow. So the doctors would write prescriptions for an alias name, and I know you said too you wanted to clarify that you want to take full responsibility for everything. Is that ethically permissible that the doctors wrote prescriptions for aliases? Because when I was reading that, I was thinking, did they get, I was just curious what
You
your
know,
thoughts are on that.
that's great. Good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. I'm not for sure by law. I'm not even for sure ethically. I know they take an oath to do no harm. So I'm not for sure. I know in the culture of that time, the doctors that were willing to help HIV patients were very few. And so I'm sure it seemed to me that their hearts to help that was the first thing I encountered about these doctors. So and honestly, the government came after, well, me in particular, because that's where the money was. Since we mismanaged the inventory, then I did profit from that. I was already a multimillionaire before I got onto the state program, but I did accentuate my profitability because of the mismanagement of that inventory. So, the doctors never dealt with drugs or government inventory. So I'm not for sure what the legal answer to that question is.
I gotcha. So the mismanagement of everything, was that just an oversight type of thing, or what was that?
It was a combination. I think it was naivete. It was an oversight. We had a wholesaler that we would order our drugs, all of our drugs from, that would, be on the shelves. And that sales rep would come in about every week. We were a huge account for them. Can you imagine? So the AZT prescription was 4 bottles for one patient a month. And the cost of that was, I think, about $1,000. And we ordered, that was my cost, if I remember correctly, and we ordered hundreds. We had so many patients on this drug. I don't have the statistics, but it was a lot. So Lou, the sales rep, would come in and he would look at my invoices, and just to help me, he would write up fake shorts just so that, like, he would personally, he would say, "Let me see your invoices for the last month." I'd give them to him, and he would write up fake shorts, which, like, he would mark, "Oh, 8 bottles didn't show up." So which was a blessing to me, which was profit for me, but again, I didn't ever think, I didn't say no, I just let him do that.
Yeah.
And of course, by the time we go to trial and the government gets all my records, it looks like, quote unquote, I stole even more government inventory that I mismanaged, but that never came out in trial.
Wow. Wow. Okay. When the investigation took place at the pharmacy, when it first started happening, what was your concern level regarding the investigation?
Eric, at the beginning, I was, not a big deal. We get audited all the time. We carry narcotics. We have to turn in, reports about that to the state. Every once in a while, you'll get that, some state agency coming in saying, "Hey, here's my credentials. We want to check your narcotics." So, being audited was not a big deal. This did feel a little different. I happened to be in the pharmacy that day when the state representatives came in. They flashed some badges and said, "Hey, we want to look at your state program." I'm like, "Hey, yeah, what do you need?" I handed them the 3x5 cards. I asked Martha to give me everything she's got of however she was keeping up with it. I never gave Martha the leadership or the oversight or that I should have. So I just gave them everything that day, and they seemed very cold and, kind of bureaucratic. But hey, they're auditors, right? Well, they come back in 2 weeks. And then they come back again 2 weeks after that. And about on the third visit, I looked at the investigator and I said, her name was Candy. Her first name was Candy, or I'm sure is Candy. I said, "Am I in trouble? Should I contact an attorney?" And she said, "Miss Forsythe, I can't give you any advice." And I thought, I better call the state board. So it took a couple of months for me to even think that this was unusual. And so that's when the ball, the snowball started going down the hill, so to speak. I called the state board, told them the situation. They're like, that didn't sound too good. I would probably, and they gave me a list of some criminal attorneys. And then for, I think it was about 2.5, almost 3 years, they investigated me. I had people following me in unmarked cars. I later found out my phones were tapped. My friends, the investigators, would show up where they worked and drill them about questions about me. They had people watching my store. So it was a full blown, kind of a witch hunt situation.
Wow. So your friends that would get questioned, were they, I'm assuming no, were they prepped to know how to answer? Yeah, that's terrifying.
Really talk about it. My fiance at the time, of course, knew, but I didn't go around telling my friends because I guess the the first thought, the thought in my forefront would be, this will go away. I'll answer all their questions. It's pretty tough right now, but it'll go away. I kept thinking, I can pull myself up by my bootstraps. I've done that my entire life. And if there's a discrepancy, I'll just pay them. I got enough cash in my checking account to write a check for anything they need.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, the investigators would show up at the workplace of my friends, ask, well, what kind of watch does Mary wear? What kind of clothes does she wear? Just ask about possessions, lifestyle, and they were not forewarned.
Wow. I
Are you
just imagine.
glad you weren't a friend of mine back then?
That'd be terrifying.
Yeah, I'm safe now, though.
Um, so all this is going on, you said, for about 2.5 years. So if you were convicted of the charges against you, it would be 15 felony counts ranging from mail fraud to theft of government property. And then the time came after this 2.5 year legal investigation, and you heard the word guilty.
Yes, before we got that, of course, that was after trial, but after the 2.5, 3 years of investigation, the first shaking news was that I had 15 felony. When my attorney called me and said, the grand jury has returned an indictment, they have charged you with Mary and Martha, with 15 felony counts. And that's when reality changed. And I didn't know then what I know now, that, a grand jury only sees the prosecution's side of the story. It's almost, the percentage of things that come back as indictments in the grand jury is pretty high. But the inconvenience and the pressure that was before that indictment turned into a crucible that I don't even have words to explain. The the pressures, and then the humiliation, and then somehow, Erica, the shame from my past began to get triggered, and then embarrassment is too light of a word. The crucible of shame, that's a new term that just came to me. I've never used that before. Was so intense that before I went to prison, I attempted suicide. I I couldn't imagine. The pressure just began to mount and mount, and my story was being told in the Dallas Morning News, and then I was on CNN for 3 nights, and uh, it, it's a pressure that I can't even describe. So one night, I couldn't take it anymore. My ex-fiance had even offered for us to flee the country before we went to trial, and I just kept hearing a voice in my head: if you do that, you'll never see your parents again. If you do that, you'll never see your parents again. So I told Mike no, but that crucible didn't go away. And so one night, I grabbed some wine, made a plan, and I drove to the pharmacy. I locked the door behind me. It was after hours, and I knew the exact combination of medicine I was going to take, downing it with alcohol, and that would end the crucible. So I'll never forget it. I walked back to the shelves, and I went to get I already had a little wine on board. I went to get the first bottle off the shelf, and I can't explain this. There's many things about my testimony I can't explain, but it is as if an angel put a hand, and I couldn't even pick up the bottle. It was like a brick invisible wall in front of that first bottle of pills that I was going to combine for my way out. I had a way out. I had a way to avoid the humiliation and the shame that not only I was currently experiencing, but the increased pain that was right ahead of me. And I kept trying. I kept trying. I couldn't even pick it up. And I literally just fell to the floor, and I thought, what a failure. I can't even kill myself. And so I just went home in defeat. And so by the time I get to trial, I was just a mess. I was broken on the inside, humiliated. The, I, I couldn't fix it. This is one of the first things in my entire life I couldn't fix. And so after 3.5 weeks of this public crucible, you're right. The verdict came back. Martha was acquitted. Mary, the other Mary, was acquitted, and I was the third verdict to be announced. And the judge hit the gavel on the bench and said, Mary Forsythe, guilty of 15 counts. And then my entire world started falling apart. In fact, in the back of the courtroom were my parents, and it was like kind of E.F. Hutton. Everybody was quiet, and you could hear my mother yelling, just wailing in my father's arms, and I began to yell in a court of law, Mother, it'll be all right. I promise you it'll be all right. And the government's on the left side of the courtroom. There was probably 100 government officials from insurance agencies, from Washington, D.C., from the Texas board, and they're over there literally cheering because I'd been convicted. And then in the midst of that, I'm hearing my mother's voice from the back of the courtroom, just wailing like it'd been broken into a million pieces. And I yell, it's gonna be all right. And my attorney's pulling at me to sit down and be quiet. It was quite the moment. One, obviously, I'll never forget. And that was midsummer sometime. And then I had to go back a couple of months later to get sentenced to find out how long I would be incarcerated.
Yeah, that's a lot. There's just even the way that you vividly described your mother's response and the wailing, and like you could put yourself in that situation and just imagine the pain for her. And then, as the reader in that section, and this is your life, and the way you wrote it, you may say, "Well, I intended it to look a little different." But as the reader, you look to to you, Mary, and say, wow, she's even when she found out she's guilty, she's trying to console her mother. And like your world, like you said, is just about to change completely. And I'm curious to know, because you had Micah, who was your ex-fiance, who stood by your side, and your parents and family, those friends too, that did they, whenever you were on the news and all this, you had this narrative about you and what was going on, did you have a lot of friends stay by your side, or did a lot leave, or did you kind of have the mix?
Well, this was one of my life lessons of what friendships really are. It's amazing who falls by the wayside when you don't have credit cards and money anymore. And, so no, I did not have many friends that stood by me at all. In fact, you get convicted, and it really shows you people's hearts towards you, honestly. And not to skip to the chase, but when I left prison 5 years later, everybody was gone except my family, and all my possessions were gone, and literally I walked out of prison with all my possessions in a copy paper box. So at that point of where we are in my story, that's when I began to lose everything. Friendships, relationships, money, possessions, all the empires and all the places of false refuge that I had built started coming just tumbling down.
Yeah, and this control, this false, sense of control that you had no longer, and this kind of just a slap of humility of what would happen in your life. And excuse me if my timeline is slightly off with it, but I know during your trial and slightly after, you had two completely separate and opposite interactions with some type of spiritual realm, so to
Mhm.
speak, the fortune teller, and then Mother Frances. Could you share a little bit of what happened with these women?
Well, I'd never thought about the spiritual world in my life. I'd gone to church since I was in the womb, right? And church was and I just am thankful for the community that we had in this small town in Western Kentucky. And we were in church every time the door was open. And Wednesday nights was my favorite because it was potluck dinner, and I could always find good food. But I didn't really have a personal relationship or any kind of spiritual, life really until all of this happened. I had a business partner and his wife that was helping me. They were going to be the creative piece for that China factory that I mentioned earlier. And so one of the things that they introduced me to was, white magic. In fact, his I forgot what I changed his name to in the book, but his real name is Cyril. Cyril, we were going to go look for office spaces, And so he had a string with a crystal on it, and he would hold it over his hand when we would go into a office space to see if it's what we wanted to rent, and it would be on a string over his hand. There's my hand, and it would circle. He would just hold it, but it would circle, and he would explain to me that that's the energy in these locations. I'd never heard anything like that. So one day we came home, and he goes, "Hey, let me see if you have the gift." I'm like, "Okay." So I held my hand out, and he held the string over my hand, and the crystal that was on the string starts choo, 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 and it started going literally horizontal. And he put it down, and he looked at me. He goes, "You have got such a gift. I want to start training you." So he began to start training me in what he called white magic. So I had no clue, no reference of what this meant. I just thought, okay, this will help us in business. But then when I got in trouble, big time adult trouble with the government, they let me know his wife would read cards and be able to, predict things, and just a world I'd never been exposed to in my life. But she said, Mary, I love you so much. I just don't know that I would get a pure reading. Let me send you to someone. So she sent me, gave me the address. I went to a normal looking house, brick, knocked on the door. A woman, I think she had an apron on the first time. Nice woman, Jessica, I think it was her name. And she said, "Oh, you must be Mary. Come on in. Did you know you're in trouble?" And so that hooked me. And we sat down at a table, and she brought out cards. There was a cross on the wall. It's just a whole new experience. I've never, didn't know anything about all this. And she began to tell me some things I already knew. No way she could have known that I was in trouble with the government. The government was planning this, this, and this. So then I began to go see Jessica on a normal basis because she would tell me what the government was doing, and I'd take that information and go tell my attorneys, and my attorneys would just look at me going, "How do you know this?" And so it was a whole world for me, Erica. I didn't understand it. Not that I have full understanding today, but that just totally intrigued me. But then when after I'd gone to trial and was convicted, the next very large bump in the road is I found out I was pregnant. And so I told Mike, I'd already made the plan. I was going to have an abortion. I was going to tell Mike. I was going to get him to take me, and we'd just move on. And when I had dinner with him that night, I'll never forget it, at a restaurant in downtown Dallas. And he just looked at me, tears in his eyes, and he goes, "No, I want you to have the baby. If you end up going to prison, I'll buy a house near the prison. I'll keep the baby, and then we'll make a family when you get out." So he convinced me to keep the baby. So the next thing I do is I go into a different den of denial. It's called planning your wedding. So I planned the wedding, totally forgot about trial, forgot about the conviction, just totally disassociated from all that. And about 5 days before the wedding, I lost the baby. So canceled the wedding. Can you imagine my poor parents? I mean, first I'm convicted, then I call them and say, "I've got tickets for you to come to Dallas. I'm getting married. I'm pregnant." Then I call them and say, "I've lost the baby. You're not coming." I mean, the pain I caused my parents. And so when when we found all this out, Mike had already, of course, paid for the honeymoon. So we went ahead and went to California. We could leave. I could leave the state still at that time. And quote unquote, we went on this honeymoon trip. And the last couple of days we were in Carmel, California. And Mike had studied theology. He had gone to some theology school and knew a bunch of stuff about God that I certainly didn't. So he wanted to go to this monastery to see a certain type of nuns that were there. They're cloistered nuns. It's in Carmel. And so we went, and I'm a wreck. I've lost a baby. I'm physically weak, emotionally worn out. I'm just going through the motions. I'm not even surviving at that point. And so we go into the service, and they are about to serve communion, and I don't know what made me, but I didn't know you really weren't supposed to take communion unless you were Catholic and in churches like that. But I just felt this. get up and go. So I got up and went and took communion, and Mike just looked at me. I came back and sat down, and then at the end of the service, the main nun, they called her name is Mother Francisca. She was the superior nun. All the other nuns filed out the back because it's a cloistered monastery, which means they don't have any contact with the community, only themselves, except this nun. So Erica, Mother Francisca went up to the front of the church and offered for anybody that needed prayer to come up, and actually she would pray for them. So Mike immediately just, grabbed me by the arm and we went up there, and Mike begins to tell Mother Francisca our story. And Mother Francisca reaches out her hand to shake my hand. And the minute my hand touched her hand, it was like a fire touched the tip of my fingers and went up my arm and up my shoulders and then down my entire body. I mean, and so I begin to cry, and Mike looks at me just thinking I'm having some emotional release because he's telling our story, and I'm on fire. I mean, my body is I'm shaking, and there is something going on that I don't understand. So they sit me down on the bench on the pew, and I can't stop, and literally, Mike has to pick me up, carry me to the car, gets me back to the Airbnb, and then I try to he keeps telling me, "I know it's emotional," and Erica is crazy. I went to tell him I wanted to go, "Mike, it's not emotional, I'm on fire," and I'd go to tell him, and no words would come out. I was literally and you can tell I'm a verbal communicator, and so for me to not to have words, that was a huge, huge moment. I couldn't get a single word out. So for 7 hours, I was on fire and could not speak. And then I'm just confused.
Yeah.
I'm like, "What has just happened?" I mean, a few kinda quote unquote supernatural spiritual things happened with my business partners, with, the kind of the white magic, but nothing like this, nothing. I even I was able to call Mother Francisca when I got back a couple weeks later, and I said, "Did you feel anything when you shook my hand?" And she was so sweet, her voice was so tender. She said, "No, Mary, but I always give the Holy Spirit room to do what he wants to do." That was, like, weird to me. I mean, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So I just didn't know. I didn't know what happened. I later got a couple of letters from Mother Francisca. Even Mike must have given her my address when I went to prison. I even still have a letter in my quote unquote prison box from Mother Francisca, just wishing me well, praying for me. It was a very weird encounter. So that was kind of my first real dramatic experience with anything quote unquote spiritual.
Yeah. So because you said you gone to church in the womb and your favorite thing was potluck on Wednesday night. And then, we flash forward to adult Mary. At some point, I'm assuming you just stopped going to church because the spiritual Holy Spirit realm type of thing was not really prevalent. When did you stop attending church?
Yeah, well, I still attended because I think that's just what I thought you
Oh,
did. So even
okay.
when I was living in Highland Park, even before I met Mike, I attended a Methodist church, the Lovers Lane Methodist Church in Dallas, and would go and pay my tithes and do all the things that you're obligated to do. And then even Mike and I, when we were living together, he was Episcopal. We'd go to his Episcopal church when we were at the ranch in Benbrook, and he would go with me to the Methodist church when he was at my house at in Highland Park. So it was just a cultural thing I think I did, without any interaction. But here's a crazy story, Erica. Like, when I would go up to my business partner's house for dinner, and we'd be planning business, and we'd drink champagne and have alcohol on board, I had to drive by that Methodist church on my way home to my house. And there were after I got in trouble, there were 2 or 3 times I drank way too much, and I'd pull into that. I'll never forget it. It's still so real to me today. I'd pull into that Methodist church, and there was a garden area, and I would sit in the garden, and I would allow myself just to cry, and cry even out to a God that I didn't know, but he knew me. And I'll never forget, it was about 3 or 4 different nights in this dark garden. Here I am crying out to a God that I didn't really have a personal relationship with, but somehow I began to cry out to him, even in my drunken state, late at night, self-reliant, full of pain, full of torment, yet I still cried out to him. That still amazes me to this day.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And the other thing that I find pretty fascinating is this white magic that you dabbled in a little bit. And I'm curious to know, you kind of said too, like even to this day, you're kind of not sure what all of that was. I was going to ask you, have you thought,
Yeah, oh, yeah. I thought about it a lot, and I do think that there are 2 realms. I do think that there's a spiritual realm. I think the veil is pretty thin, a lot thinner than what we think and than what we realize in our everyday lives. I'm no expert in the spiritual realm, but I do know it exists. And even when I went to prison, one of the first books, not that I kind of agree with the entire story, but it's a lot of metaphors, is Frank Peretti's books on this present darkness. It was crazy, Erica, that here I am incarcerated. And after a couple of spiritual things happened when I first got there, one of the first books that kind of came across my path was, again, Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness, and it's a story about a small town, and it would kinda flip. The story would flip. It would be just, it would talk about this small town and what was happening, and there was a church involved and families, and then the next chapter, it was like the veil was open, and it would show you the spiritual realm, and I thought, that again, I don't agree with everything. That's not the point. It's not a theology book. The metaphors worked for me, and I thought, I think I've experienced some of this. And so I don't know that I'll ever really know, but I do know that there is a world that we can't see that's probably more real than the things we can see.
Hmm. So interesting. And I also wonder, the whole white magic thing is just pretty interesting to me. And I wonder too, what, like, if that was evil, if it was not, I'm just like,
Mm.
it's kind of new to me too, in a way. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
what was it completely? Okay. Well, something you shared in the book too, and kind of a little bit now, was that, you always you were able to get what you wanted and work things out that way of, you thought, okay, there's going to be a way. I'm not going to go to prison. You had connections with somebody who could get you pardoned by the United States, by the president of the United States.
That's right.
And you waited in anticipation and hope that you would be pardoned, and you wouldn't make it, but that didn't happen. And then this entire new life that you had never dreamt of happened. You entered into prison. You were stripped, searched. You talked about the humiliation that you experienced with that. You walked into this prison cell. Describe to me just those first moments, what you saw, your fears, everything.
Well, it's unbelievable. I mean, the sudden loss of 100% control. The sudden loss of every prop that I had created to help me to do everyday life was gone. But like you said, when I went into prison, one of my mantras was, I can do anything for 3 weeks, because I'd been promised, the president of the United States who was leaving office, Bush Sr., had, through some social connections that Mike and I had promised to pardon me as he was leaving office, and he was leaving office within a couple of weeks of me self-surrendering. So I kept thinking, I can do anything for a couple of weeks. So again, my self-reliance was what I leaned on, but still the loss of everything. So the check-in process was more horrific than what I can describe. than what I even described in the book. It's one thing to be embarrassed and humiliated in that crucible of shame that I talked about. It's a whole new level when you get strip searched. And so I made it through that, and then I'm carrying my roll, my bunk roll, the small sack of personal possessions that I could come in, and I'm walking down the sidewalk and a guard is leading me to take me to my assigned cell. And I just looked at all these people and I thought, I might look like them, but I'm not one of them. So I get to my cell and I kind of stick to myself the first couple of weeks, and I just keep thinking I can do anything. I'm assigned to it was horrible. Like the next morning, a guard came and woke me up at like 5 o'clock. I had to take this huge, heavy industrial broom and sweep the sidewalks that didn't even have anything on it for hours before 7 o'clock. From 5 to 7, I had to just do this labor, by the way, for 17 cents an hour. And then I had to work for a guard in the back of the warehouse where I had to drive a forklift, bait rat traps, yes, bait rat traps, and mop those warehouse floors, again for 17 cents an hour. But I kept my mantra still held me up. I can do anything for a couple of weeks. And then the day that Bush was leaving office, after that transition of power at DC in DC, that night when I was able to get on a phone and call Mike Collect, I just said, my first thing was, when are you going to come get me? And he just began to cry. And he said, Bush has left the White House and he did not sign your pardon papers. So I just said, get the appeal rolling. And I didn't even know what to do. But the next morning when I woke up, of course, I'm in a small cell with 3 other inmates. They're bunk beds, a small table in between, 4 tiny little lockers. But the next morning I roll out of that prison bunk and I get on the tile floor on my knees, put my head over my very thin mattress, and I just said, God, I can't do this anymore. Now, the warden didn't come in and go, good job, Mary, you're out of here. Nothing changed on the outside. But I truly believe to this day, Erica, that was the moment, the key that allowed change to truly begin. So 8 days later, I was in a chapel service. What do you do when you want to get out of your cell? You go to chapel, right? You don't want to be locked in. And so every time there was anything going on at the chapel, I would go. And so I was in the chapel one day. It was on the weekend, and a guard comes in the back. And whenever you had a visitor, they'd say, they'd call my inmate number 22490-077, or sometimes they would address you by your last name, Forsyth. You got a visitor. And I don't know if you've ever visited anyone in prison, but you have to be pre-approved. You got to do a background check, and you have to, the inmate has to submit the names of people they want on their visiting list. So I had 4 people, mom, dad, my sister, and Mike. So I'm like, it has to be Mike because mom and dad are in Kentucky. My sister has 2 children. She's not going to come unannounced. So it has to be Mike. So I walk out into the visiting area and I'm looking around and there's nobody I see. And this man walks up to me and he goes, are you Mary? And I'm like, who are you? Yes, who are you? And he said, my name's Gary. God sent me. Can we talk? And I went, yeah, I guess. I mean, it was so weird, Erica. I just didn't even know what was happening. So we go outside to the visiting area. And of course, we're behind razor wire. There's a couple of benches. There's a couple of picnic tables where inmates are sitting across from their visitors. And we're a little bit to the side, but the other inmates are maybe 6, 7 feet away and guards walk everywhere. It's not like you have any privacy, right?
Yeah.
So we sit down on a bench and Gary sits to my left and he just looks at me and he goes, and I have no understanding of what's about to happen at all. He looks at me and goes, do you want to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit? And I just looked at him and I said, did he ask you to ask me that? And Gary goes, yeah, he did. And I said, okay, I'll take it. I mean, you're in prison, you have nothing. Somebody offers to give you something, you'll just probably say yes. And so he said, stand up. I stood up and and again, I can only tell you what happened. I don't know how much I can explain what all this meant, but he barely touched me on the forehead, and I fall down on the floor, and it wasn't scare or on the ground, on the grass. It wasn't scary. It was like it's like a if you're backing into the ocean and a wave catches you and you just kinda lean into it. I don't know. I'm down on the ground. That's all I know. And the next thing he does is he puts his hands on my stomach, and all of this is breaking every security rule in the book. I mean, there's no reason guards should have come over, inmates on the ground, and a visitor is touching an inmate. No, 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 no. This doesn't happen. So I'm on the ground, he's touching me, and then I have this thought because he's saying some stuff, and I used to fly to Milan for the weekend to go shopping, right? So and then before Mike, I dated a guy in London, so I'd traveled, for pleasure and shopping before, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, this guy is so cool. He's bilingual. What language is that? Is that Chinese? I've never been to China." I mean, he's saying stuff I don't understand. And then, again, this is crazy. My eyes are closed. I'm on the ground. His hands are on me. He's talking something. And then I hear a storm. Like, we're in Texas and storms can get pretty crazy in Texas. And I hear this huge storm coming. So my next very poignant thought is, "Oh my gosh, he better hurry up or we're going to get wet." And I just hear this storm coming. And the next thing I know, he just says something in English. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't yell. It's just normal. He said it about like this. He said, "In the name of Jesus, come out of her." Now, I, I don't know what happened, but I do know that something left me. And all of a sudden, I had access to peace that I'd never experienced in my life. I had never felt what I had just felt. And then the next thing, the guards are yelling, "Visiting hours are over." And so he reaches down and picks me up, and then I have to, get processed out. And of course, I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind. What just happened?"
Yeah.
And I'm heading back to my cell, and then you got counted 5 times a day. I had to get back to the cell in time to be counted. And then after they count the entire prison, then you could go to chow, which is your dinner. Every meal was chow, right? And so I'm like going, "Oh my God, I'm going crazy. What's happening?" And I had been there long enough that excuse me, I had seen other inmates lose it, and they would take them away in a white jacket, and when they brought them back 3 to 5 days later, they'd have them on medicine that would, like psychotics, and so I'm thinking, "Oh my god, they're gonna come get me in a white jacket. How far could I stick a pill up my nose so I don't so I'm thinking medicine, I'm thinking bioavailability, I'm thinking, "Oh my god, they're gonna come get me." So I go straight to my cell. I don't go to chow. I'm scared to pieces of what just happened because something happened I can't explain, and I think I'm gonna get taken away.
Yeah.
I get up the next morning. I wake up unusually early, about 5 o'clock, and I woke up and I thought, "Oh my gosh, I've got a desire for something I've never desired before." So I get in my locker and I pull out a tiny little Bible. I still have it that someone had given me before. I guess you give Bibles to people when they go to prison. I'd never read my Bible. I think I had 5 of them, but never used it. But somebody had given me and I took that small Bible, and when I could leave my cell, I went into the shower stall, went into the bathroom area, opened the shower stall, sat down, and I opened the Bible. And I don't know how to explain this, but I knew there was a presence I could tangibly feel, and it wasn't warm water from the shower head. There was no water going. It it was like a mist, a presence, and I just knew. How did I know? Don't know how I knew. I knew that was the Holy Spirit, and I knew that the Holy Spirit was there to help me, and that was the beginning of learning and really began a journey of healing and transformation and renewal that came while I was still incarcerated.
Wow. That it is such a phenomenal story. One, Gary, who was not approved. We don't know how that even happened. Did you ever did you years
Yeah.
later did you say, Gary, how did you get in? I mean, obviously
Yeah.
we know that was the Lord's hand.
Yeah. He actually, unfortunately, he passed away last year, but he became a good friend. He was a businessman from Austin, Texas, and God audibly spoke to him. I learned this years later, of course, and stayed in relationship with him until he passed away last year. But he told me the story. He said, God audibly spoke to him, just like that. There's a story in the Bible, a man named Ananias, and God audibly spoke to Ananias and said, "Hey, Ananias, I want you to go to Straight Street. I want you to pray for my servant Paul." And Ananias is going like, "You got to be kidding me! Like Paul kills people." And God said, "Hey, go on down there and pray for him, and I'll open his eyes." Well, I used to call Gary my Ananias because God audibly spoke to him. He was in Austin, Texas, and he literally told Gary, "I want you to go to such and such prison on such and such day and pray for my servant, Mary Forsythe." And we did not know each other. And so he came down, and again, this was after I'd been released. He told me this story. I said, every year on our anniversary, I would call him. It was in February. I think February 21st, 22nd, something like that.
It's February. It's in the book. It's February 22nd because that's my birthday.
22nd. I sort of say you get a lot. You've kind of been healed when you forget dates and stuff like that. You're like, oh, somewhere, Anyway, like February 22nd. We would always retell the story, and almost every year he'd tell me another detail. I said, Gary, when are you going to tell me the whole thing? He goes, well, I just didn't think about it. But when he came in and asked to see me, this guard, he told me, was very rude. He was kind of disheveled, the guard was, and he was like, he just stood there because he knew what God had told him. And so it in the 30 seconds that he was there, another guard comes and says, "Hey, take your break." And this other guard, he just said his uniform was ironed. He had a bright white smile, and all he did was he looked at Gary and said, "I'll get Mary for you." Like, Gary didn't even ask that new guard who to see, and
Whoa.
that guard called me by my first name. So, I can't say, "Oh, that's an angel." I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that Gary broke almost every security rule in the book, and and this is what happened. So, and then when we ended up outside, and then when he would tell from his point of view what happened when I was on the ground, I was like, "Gary, why didn't those guards come over? I'm on the ground, you're touching me, you're breaking every rule." He goes, "Well, I could barely see you." I'm like, "What do you mean you could barely see me?" He goes, "Well, the this cloud was so thick around us, I could see you." I said, "Well, why didn't the guards see the cloud?" He goes, "I don't know." I mean, so I
Wow.
can only tell you what happened. I'm certainly not gonna tell you I understand it.
Yeah. Well, okay. And then you kind of rewind and go back when you went and saw Mother Francis or friend. I think in the
Frances,
book it's
yeah,
Francesca. Yes. And then this when she touches you and she said, she said, I didn't feel anything but the Holy Spirit and this fire for 7 hours.
yeah.
You're not able to speak. And then we're here and Gary comes from the Lord. And whether this guard was an angel or not, probably. I mean, we don't know.
We
Or
don't know.
God told him, hey, you're gonna let this is for
We
me.
do know that God used this person to open the door.
Yes.
That's what I
Yes.
know.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know if you heard me say this, but when Gary came, February 22nd is my birthday. So when I read that, I thought,
That's
yes.
crazy.
Not that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I was just like, wow, that's I mean, just a
Good, I'll have to call you now because I can't call Gary and say, "Happy
yeah.
birthday." You can tell me happy anniversary.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, okay, so that was the start of a completely life transformation for you. Newsflash for everybody that just because this happened, Mary did not, life wasn't easier. I know that it helped having a purpose and you did not leave prison immediately. As you said, there were 5 years, but I am curious to know, you share too in the book, and I'm going to kind of mess this up a little bit. I know there was a significance with the mop closet for reading purposes, right, of the Bible. You had just like enough light, or what was the mop closet again?
Yeah, well, those are two different stories on that. There was just enough light, like many times the Lord would ask me to not flip upside down, but turn my head to the other. Like you'd most of the time sleep with your head away from your prison door, but sometimes at night I would wake up and I'd feel the Lord say, "Turn your head," and I'd turn my head to where my feet should be because the light would come in through the door just enough that I could read my Bible during the night. So that was just crazy. But the mob closet was right next to my prison cell. And, women, everybody's life around me was broken, including my own. But the Lord just put on my heart to pray for people. So I would take women into the mop closet and do whatever the Holy Spirit showed me to do. Either pray for them, God would sometimes begin to give me visions of things that were troubling them. Like I'll never forget one of the first times I saw something in my mind's eye. You can call it a vision or whatever. If it's God inspired, it always leads to life. And and I saw two little girls in heaven, two little baby girls. And I just told this woman, this inmate, I said, I just see your two baby girls in heaven, two infants. And she bawls. She had had two abortions, never told anyone, and God was letting her know that everything was okay. And she even told me, even from that moment, she felt forgiven. She was able to receive forgiveness. And gosh, I just, through all the experiences, here we are behind cinder block walls. We're behind razor wires. The fence has black tarpaulin on it. You can't see out. But the truth of who I really am, and freedom is available in every situation, regardless how dark, the light will overcome. I mean, I'm not trying to be too metaphorical, but it's true. I mean, it's almost surreal because the woman that I told you about earlier that was in bondage and darkness and was in pain caused people so much pain. Maybe not so much with the court case, but when you're in pain and living in darkness, you leave a trail of hurting people behind you. And God began to interact with me in a way that, he began to rewrite my story even while I was incarcerated.
As he was rewriting your story, you're reading the Bible. Like you said, you never really picked up a Bible. So you're reading it, you're hungry for his word. I'd love to hear too, just as this transformation is happening in your heart on your day-to-day basis, because life was not beautiful there.
No.
I mean, I really want to encourage the listeners to pick up Mary's book, because just the description, and you, like, when you read your story, you can get just a tiny glimpse of what you experienced, and what, the heartache, the pain, the struggles, the back and forth of there's still, all this hurt and pain that the not feeling wanted that you've had before. So how, as God started to work and heal you, how how did you see that change? How did that affect your day to day when you were working for 17 cents an hour?
Mhm. The first time that I remember a voice, like something communicating to my heart, even when I wasn't holding the Bible, I was sitting out on a bench outside in the yard area, and I had a little bit of time before I had to go check in at the warehouse. So I just sat, and the sun was rising, and I heard this communication in my heart: "I'm for you. I'm not against you." And that was huge for me. You have to understand that I had documentation that was public to the nation that said the United States government, the United States of America versus Mary Elizabeth Forsythe. So the whole nation was against me. The entire country was against me. And this soft voice of truth going, that that's not the most important part. The most important part is that I'm for you. I'm not against you. It's hard to give as much power to that as what actually happened. All of a sudden, somebody was on my side. I had been self-reliant. I had been independent. And a lot of that was because I felt orphaned all my life. And now all of a sudden, for the first time, I'm not alone. So that ushered me into, oh, wow, I can include God on everything because he's on my side. And that was one of the first steps towards freedom on this whole journey of that we call life.
Wow. You talk about in the book too, where you were in transit to Ashfield, and that you had heard that there, were just horrible things that would happen while in transit. And then the way you described Ashfield, it was just like drastically worse than what you had experienced in Benton. And so there was a story I want to say, and I didn't write her name down. I think it was Rita, but it might be a different name. Or if you just have any powerful moment from your time in prison or in Ashfield to share with listeners that you think would be very beneficial for them to hear.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone's ever been in this situation where things are bad and you really don't think they can get any worse. And then they do. So the prison I was in was obviously tough day in and day out. But then I had to, what they call, I'll use some prison terminology, I had to pull chain, which means I was in transit. And so because I had to have a court appearance, I'd put in for my appeal. It was denied. And I think it's the Fifth Circuit down in New Orleans, suggested that I actually get more time. So I'm going back to have a resentencing hearing, and I had to go to what I call an inner prison. There was no windows. I was shackled. I was chained, put in an orange jumpsuit. Orange is not my color. 2 left little clog kind of things, a urine-stained mattress that I had to drag down a hall. I had to walk past these bars, and honestly, behind the bars, I thought, these people are animals. And so, by the time I got to my prison cell, I mean, I was exhausted, no energy, couldn't believe my surroundings had gotten this much worse, and I just sit down on my bunk, and an inmate from across there was, I think probably about 12 cells in a pod, individual cells, bars. You've seen it on TV many times. But an inmate from one of the other cells comes up, and she just looks at me and she goes, well, excuse me, I'd sat down. They did bring me a meal. I'm not for sure what the food was because it was unidentifiable, and because I was in between, so they did bring me a tray, and I was sitting on the table out in the kind of little common area, and I'd bowed my head to pray for something. I'm not for sure what it was, and the inmate came over to me and she goes, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes." And she smiled, and she didn't have any front teeth. And she said, "This is an answer to my prayer. I just asked God last night to send me somebody to teach me the Bible." So that night, we had our first Bible study. There was 2 Spanish women that I don't think spoke any English, but they came. We had about 30 minutes of open time that we could gather. And then one of the Spanish women was pregnant. And she would never get milk. Nobody in the whole pod would ever have milk, and she at least needed milk. So I told the girls, I said, let's pray that she gets milk. And sure enough, the very next day, 2 cartons of milk were on her tray. No one else got milk. So God just began to show himself to us in that time. It was extremely dark. It was extremely tough. In fact, the ceiling, I looked up at the ceiling in my cell and I thought, what has happened here? There were all these marks on the ceiling, and I thought, what in the world has happened here? And then about 1 or 2 days later, I looked down and I saw an inmate standing on her bunk, and your nails would break. My skin started, just breaking out, but your nails would break. So you would stand on your bunk and file your nails on the ceiling just so that they wouldn't be so sharp. I mean, everything just began to die so quickly there. But that was just on the outside. I mean, we began to seek the Lord together, and I just began to see some amazing things.
And then what was interesting too with the story there was that then you went in transit back to where you came from, which isn't normally heard of.
No, it's not. Most of the women there that I talked to had been there. They'd had their court appearance, and they were waiting to pull chain to go somewhere else for 1, 2, 3 years. And I thought, I'm gonna, if I make it out of here, I think I had 3 years left. I thought, I, 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 I just didn't even know what to think. But one of the things the Lord had taught me before I was in this situation was to keep my thoughts within 24 hours. When I was at the previous prison, if I had a thought that was beyond 24 hours, I would panic. I would be anxious. I would be freaking out. And the Spirit just taught me. He said, and he would say, Mary, you've got to learn to think Philippians 4:6, 4:8, excuse me. I didn't even know Philippians was a book in the Bible. And when I figured that out, I found Philippians 4:8, and it's that scriptures that says, think on these things that are good and noble. And so I knew that he was giving me a strategy, not just to survive, but to thrive. So all my thoughts, I had to pay attention, but I had to make sure I didn't think about what am I going to do when I get out? Is Mike going to be there? I couldn't go there. I had to stay within he gives you grace for the day. But then I had to make sure that my thoughts were on all the things that are in Philippians 4:8. So I'd been training and I didn't even know it. He's one of the things I like to say is he's preparing you now for what he's prepared for you. And so I was training back then. So now when I'm in this inner prison, I continued with using the tools that he had taught me. But then it was a miracle. After 10 days, it was 4 o'clock in the morning. It was on a Monday morning at 4. The marshals came to get me and they said, Forsythe, you're pulling chain. So I had to, get out of my cell. It was the same marshals, the U.S. Marshals that had taken me there. And they just made the comment. They said, you must have some kind of attorney. Nobody ever gets out of here this fast. And I'm like, and even after 10 days, I'm weak physically, mentally. It was probably some of the worst shape that I'd been in, just in all sense of the word. And so I get in the car and I don't know what they won't tell me where they're taking me. I don't know if they're taking me back to the same prison. But they did. They took me back to Benton. And when they checked me in, I knew the guard that was checking me in because I'd already been in that prison for several years. And she just looked at the marshals and said, Forsythe, what are you doing here? I don't have any paperwork for you. And the marshals said, well, we do. And they handed the officer the paperwork. And she goes, this is crazy. This paperwork was signed on a Sunday. And then I remembered, right before I went to this inner prison, I had read a book by Corrie ten Boom called The Hiding Place. And she was an elderly woman in World War II. Her and her family went to concentration camps for helping the Jews. And Corrie had been released from prison on an administrative error 1 week before all the prisoners her age were gassed to death. And of course, that's a very extreme example, but I remembered that even in my weakened state, and I thought, God's done for me what he did for Corrie. And then I went back and they even put me back in the same cell that I'd left 10 days earlier.
Wow. As somebody who follows Jesus, I see God's hand in your life completely. But I want to know, for people who don't believe or agree, how are you so certain that what you experienced has to be from him and not just some other spiritual thing or just, like you said, like you had this fear that they would take you away because you had seen, way back from the beginning when Gary was there, you had seen people get put on medication. And so how are you so certain and that this is from the Lord?
I didn't know this verse at the time, and it's not just because of a verse, but it's really experiential. Every Everything that I encountered brought life and freedom and goodness. There is a verse in the Bible that makes it pretty clear for you to understand what things come from. It's John 10:10. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus has come to give life and give it more abundantly. And I had, and sometimes you have a lens on life and you think what brings you life is actually bringing death. And that's where I was. I mean, I'll never forget when I first started reading Psalms, I'm like, what in the world? Because it was talking, I mean, I thought I was smart, successful. I mean, really succeeding in life. I mean, this was my self image. I mean, even when I went to prison, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? But honestly, that's how I thought of myself because I'd accomplished all these things. And then I started reading in, not Psalms, but Proverbs. I started reading in Proverbs and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not successful. I'm actually a fool. So I started reading what the Bible said about a foolish life. And I thought, that's me. That's me. That's me. And I realized that I really had a delusional way of seeing life. It wasn't reality. And most, I could say, of the things that I was pursuing actually were bringing my life into a darker place, into more bondage, and actually accentuating my own pain. So, gosh, when you have a lens change and you actually see, "Oh my goodness, this is really life-giving and this was foolish." And it's Erica, it's hard to explain, but it's like my chooser was broken. It's almost like I was in so much bondage, it was really hard for me to, on a consistent basis, choose what was right and good and not harmful. I mean, I would have my moments, but then after Gary came in, it was like all of a sudden, even though I felt like a shell of a human being because whatever left, whatever happened in that moment, I was like, I didn't even know myself. But then I began to know myself, and it was based on truth that I'm favored, that God's for me, not against me, and that began to reform me, to transform me, and so I think because I've experienced life, and I certainly know what bondage is and pain, and it's not that I don't have that anymore, but now I can see how, and I'm empowered, I'm free enough to choose a path that's gonna lead to life, and God's always helping me to see what that is. There's a scripture in the Old Testament that says, "Here's life, here's death. If you're not for sure what to do, answer key, choose life." So, but I didn't live that way before. I never gave a second thought into what wisdom or life would be. I just pretty much did what I wanted to do. I was l I just didn't ever even think that way, and then whatever God did in all those things, He empowered me to see very differently. So, I just encourage, if someone doesn't know Jesus or maybe knows, institutional religion, a good place to start is, "Jesus, are you in me? Am I in you?" Just ask Him, and I bet He'll answer. He'll answer in a way that you can hear, that you can perceive. We say God speaks, but I like to say it this way: God rarely speaks, but He's always communicating. Like when you read my book, A Glimpse of Grace, you'll see where I learned to quote unquote hear God or perceive His communication through many things, through a sign or a symbol or a dream or a song. And and when you begin to encounter life, it's so relieving. It's like you found the fountain of youth, because it's every heart's desire. And and I'm so thankful that I came to the end of myself, and that freedom is, and really it's a relationship of transformation. I'm still being changed. But I think when you get in touch with God's voice and God's heart by just asking, and it's experiential. It's not just knowledge. It's not just, well, I know Jesus. Well, okay. but what about experiencing him in your everyday life? You know, it's one thing to serve God. It's a whole nother thing to live with God in your everyday life. And that's where true life is while we're on the earth.
Yeah. And, you know, you, the thing that I think is so important for people to hear is that you on the outside had everything, right?
Mm,
You had the money, you had the house, you had
yeah.
the career, you had it all. You had the relationship. And then but yet there was so much emptiness, and then that was stripped. And then like you said, you've experienced bondage. You've experienced the low of the low. And in that moment is where he met you, and that's where you found life and the true joy. And we have gone way on a lot further. Mary and I talked about maybe we're gonna have to have a part two. I might have to even split this up and do a part three. So I'm gonna flash forward, and I have your book right here. So people who are watching, here it is. It's just, I mean, and then Mary goes through the moments of when you were leaving and entering the life outside of prison, and just the turmoil that went on with that. There's just so much to unpack there too. And then, now you have spoken thousands of people, all tons of different countries and prisons everywhere, just sharing about what God did in your life. And maybe we will do another part, Mary, just to hear more about that. But I do want to ask you my last question, just for time's sake, because I'd love to hear you share a little bit more as well. I feel like, the whole point of this podcast is really to encourage women to realize that they're more than the age that they're given. Because sometimes it's just like, oh, I hate that I'm getting older and I'm not where I thought I would be. And you were where you wanted to be, but then that got stripped away, or their life circumstance, something happens. And so, how old were you was it 31 when
Yeah,
you?
it's in my early 30s. So the whole deal was about, so they investigated me for 3.5 years. I was incarcerated for 5, and then excuse me, and then I was on probation for 3. So that was just that part. And then I had to start, like you said, when I came out, that was a whole nother journey. But I think I so get your audience. And let me say this to encourage the minute you can get in touch with the Father's heart for where you are in life, peace will come. Like, people ask me all the time, "Do you feel like your 30s were taken from you?" And, well, no, more my childhood, honestly. My life began while I was incarcerated. And so, but regardless of where you are in life, when you get in touch with that, God's not surprised where you are. And failure or loss and even in pain doesn't stop the Father from affirming where you are right now. When you get in touch with, when you become aware how much the Father values you, how significant you are, and how much worth you have right now in this stage. And anything beyond that, when you say, "I should be, could have been," I call that just future tripping. You're not where reality is. God's so for you right now. You have so much. I've gotten so rooted and grounded in the value that God gives me, and the significance that God gives me, and the worth that God gives me. So it doesn't matter what happens to me. It has much less power over me now, because I'm rooted and grounded in significance, worth, and value that comes from my dad.
Wow.
Now, that is power in life, and that will root and ground you in every circumstance. And I've lost everything. I've lost a baby. My entire millions in my stock portfolio was taken by the government. Spoiler alert, my ex-fiance married someone else 3 months before I left prison. I came out with nothing but a copy paper box, like I said earlier. But that doesn't impact my worth, my significance, and my value back then or today. Like during COVID, I didn't travel a lot. I wasn't holding a microphone. I wasn't going to the nations. Can I tell you that did not impact the way I saw myself, the way I felt about myself, um, because I've gotten that from the true source, from my dad, from my father, from Jesus, and from the Spirit. And that's true with you too. So I encourage you, ask him, can you show me how you value me? Can you show me that I'm significant? Can I tell you? He will do it, and he will root and ground your heart in a place that can't be moved.
Thank you, Mary. That was beautiful. I appreciate your time. I appreciate just your wisdom and your openness and just sharing very small but a very impactful part of of your story. I will put the information to your book, A Glimpse of Grace by Mary Forsythe, on in the show notes. I'll also put your website. Would you like to share anything else where people can find you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, we do. I've got a YouTube channel, and if you want some kind of just spiritual building, I call it e-mentoring. There's quite a few videos. All that's free. Just access those, and would love to take a little bit of life's journey with you. If you want some spiritual discipleship, would love to do that.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate you joining me today on the More Than Your Age podcast.
Thank you so much.